Hey everyone, welcome in to another daily editorial here on the KE Report. We're going to be focusing on different forms of energy production, some of the newer forms out there like solar and wind, as well as nuclear energy, which in all fairness is not new, but it's coming back onto a lot of people's radar. This all ties into this whole energy transition and most likely the mix of energy sources that we will need to continue to quite frankly, power the world. We're chatting with Matt Badiali, editor of the New Energy Investor newsletter, which is published under the Mangrove Investor brand. Now, Matt, again, balancing out these different forms of energy and a lot of these new ones that are getting a lot of funding, but are also kind of slowly growing in their own right. Let's start off with solar and also the options that come from the uranium side of the market. How are you balancing out, again, this renewed interest in new energy sources as well as using uranium?
Well, thanks for having me back, guys. It's an interesting time right now in energy because, especially when it comes to electricity, we've been very focused on coal as the main baseload power. And I say, up till about 10 years ago, coal was king when it came to electricity. That's what we produced. And still around the world, we use coal to produce a lot of electricity. And then nuclear power was kind of moving up until the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in the early mid 2000s, and that kind of faded away. But we tend to look at power generation in kind of monolithic terms. There is a source of fuel that generates electricity. And that's the old way to look at it. And I think going forward, what we need to look at is that there will be a pretty broad mix of contributors to electricity, and it's going to be a fit the model kind of a thing. So, we're going to have windmills out there. We're going to have solar panels out there. I think we're going to have a new kind of modular nuclear power plants that are going to become more popular. Instead of building these giant power plants, there are a lot of small style nuclear power plants that are being looked at and developed that have a lot of promise in terms of how fast they can be built and plugged into the grid. And they won't produce as much power as the giant ones, but they won't need anywhere near the footprint. But there are pros and cons to all of them, and that's how I'm looking at it. We're going away from that monolithic coal as electricity, and we're getting into a much more of a portfolio system.
Well, Matt, we were talking off mic a little bit about an article that the most famous Substacker Doomberg put out, and he was making the point in it in favor of nuclear power's energy density. And he was talking about the Palisades nuclear generating station. It's in Michigan, and he was pointing out that just that one plant in Michigan produces the same equivalent of power as 35% of all solar electricity across the entire US. So all of US's solar capacity, it can basically do one third of it out of one station. And he was pointing out that you typically on a big solar farm need about 20,000 acres to replicate the electricity of a plant like that. And this plant takes up a little over 400 acres. So just the energy density of the nuclear power is one of the benefits. But what are your thoughts on solar and wind? Because that is the direction the policymakers want to take things in carbon free power. Uranium is also one of the only other forms of energy generation that's got a carbon neutral, carbon free footprint. So, what do you think about the balance of that discussion going on with policymakers and investors alike of renewables, solar and wind versus nuclear? They're all carbon free, but they have a lot different space requirements.
Yeah, and it's not just the space. I mean, it's reliability as well. The nuclear power plants are over-engineered for reliability because when they go wrong, it's really, really bad. There was just a weather event in Texas that took out a massive solar power station, and it was a hailstorm. A hailstorm's not going to take a nuclear power plant offline, but it absolutely demolished the solar plant. And so that is a problem. And we've always known that renewable power has limitations. Solar's glaring inefficiency is night. When there's no sun, there's no power. And same thing with windmills. Windmills have a window that they can operate in, and if If the wind doesn't blow hard enough or it blows too hard, you have to shut them down. So there is a place for these power sources. Because, like I said, I firmly believe that we need a portfolio of power supply. And if you're going to replace something like coal, which needs to happen, frankly, because not just for carbon, but coal is just a bad actor. I mean, I could go on and on about the pollution that coal has caused, but that is the issue. To replace something like that, it's going to take nuclear and it's going to take solar and it's going to take natural gas. People don't want to hear that, but natural gas is a cheap byproduct of the oil industry, and we're not getting away from oil anytime soon. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's methane, it's CH4. When you burn a molecule of methane, you produce two molecules of water and one of carbon dioxide. So, it's clean. You don't have a lot of ugly byproducts like you have with coal, because coal is just basically a petrified swamp. So whatever was in there, all the sulfur, all the nitrogen, all the metals, that all gets burnt when you burn coal. You just don't have that with natural gas. So I do think that there's room for a consortium of these energy suppliers, but I think that people need to take a much harder look at nuclear power right now. I think that's the area that holds the most potential for both growth and success.
What about technology advances within any of these new energy sources or even utilizing uranium in a better way? Or what sort of technology advances have crossed your radar?
Yeah, I mean, the most glaringly obvious one is you go back to natural gas fracking. I mean, the reason that natural gas is under $2 a thousand cubic feet right now is because we have the ability to drill a mile down and 2 miles horizontally and then crack open that rock and release a flood of natural gas. So what that did was take a very useful and valuable energy source and make it very, very cheap. But yeah, and change really is the story for nuclear power plants. I mean, when you look at most of the nuclear power plants that are in operation, I mean, I don't know when the last new one was built. Shad, you might, that's in operation, but it was forever ago. We finally have a kind of a modern reactor coming on. It's the Alvin W. Vogtle power plant in Georgia. That just came on in July of 2023. But that's not even one of the real modern ones. We want to see some of these really new, really small modular reactors come online that are very efficient. We have the ability, we have the technology to do it. I just think it's political will when it comes to that. But you're also seeing there's been a lot of great engineering in windmill design. I mean, the size of the windmills that we can now put together, the offshore windmills are huge. They're absolutely tremendous. And you have this innovative engineering that combines kind of what we've learned with offshore drilling with the ability to scale up these wind generators that we've developed over the last 20 years as we've seen these things deploy around the country, around the world, really. But, so there are absolutely some fantastic technological innovations out there. It's overshadowed by AI at the moment.
Yeah, Matt, about everything on the planet's overshadowed by AI right now as far as the investing universe. But to your point on small modular reactors, that is a new technology that is taking hold. It'll be a nice demand driver for uranium. And there already are some small nuclear reactors that have been deployed in Russia successfully that are floating reactors. They don't have the same meltdown risk that the larger reactors do. And they could be used in remote areas where you wouldn't build a power station, for a city, for a large business complex. And so they have a lot of uses, and the military is already using some of them. You could argue that submarines, nuclear subs, are already small modular reactors, and they're floating all over the ocean already. But this brings up the wider discussion for investors listening, Matt, on what raw materials are going to feed which energy source. Like, we know that coal and oil and nat gas are that energy source. When you look at solar, a lot of people give lip service to the silver that is going to be needed as that sector continues to unfold. And that's because it's a huge driver of silver demand right now. When you look at nuclear, uranium's obviously the main driver. When you look at windmills, rare earths for the magnets, the dysprosium and neodymium are the big drivers. So for commodities investors out there, they're interested in the discussion because which commodities are going to drive the energy of the future? How do you look at some of those debates that investors have as it relates to energy and the raw materials that are needed?
Sure. I am a homer when it comes to copper for all this because if you're making windmills, you've got to wrap those motors with copper wire. You can't substitute it. You can't substitute aluminum in the motor. So there is a huge demand for copper. As long as we're building these wind farms and solar farms, you've got to look at lithium batteries. I mean, you're seeing much more grid scale batteries come online now. And I know that we've talked here in the past about why lithium isn't the best metal in the long term for these batteries, but right now, lithium is still in demand for these batteries. And I think that you're going to see it's come way down, but lithium has the potential for at least the next, I would say, 5, 6 years. It's going to be the battery metal until something better comes along, and something better hasn't come along yet. So, I'm still looking at copper. I'm still looking at lithium to some extent. I still like uranium because to me, you have this combination for uranium of we've neglected uranium for a decade. It's had a lost decade. And you have the kind of the political pressure to generate carbon-free power. You saw kind of the last holdouts, anti-nuclear holdouts in Europe kind of go away because they couldn't juxtapose a zero carbon without bringing nuclear power into the fold, into their energy fold. They couldn't do it. So now we're seeing nuclear, and none of this happens quickly. I think to take a step back for every investor needs to understand that these are macro trends. They're not going to happen tomorrow. We're not talking about meme stocks. We're talking about positioning yourself for an 18-month to 2 year to 3 year trend and what's going to happen. I mean, if you had done this, with lithium 5 years ago, you'd be in a great place right now. If you'd done it with a lot of these metals 5 years ago, uranium, I mean, you would have made a lot of money. And that's where we want to be right now. We want to be thinking about this now with the understanding that the payoff is probably not tomorrow, but more like 18 months, 24 months, 36 months down the road.
When looking at these investment angles, then look, everyone does want to attach a reason to why these different energy sources could move up, why they are a good investment. How much do we need to balance out considerations in North America compared to the rest of the world? You even brought up a little bit of Europe, but even what China's doing, some of the other major energy consumers. How much, when you're looking at it from an investment angle, is it a global versus North American question?
No, this is global. There's no question. The world is electrifying. That is the trend. And what that means is you're replacing a massive fuel source of fossil fuels and coal, and to some extent oil because of gasoline. When you think about a barrel of oil, I think 60% of the oil that's consumed in the United States, which is the world's largest consumer of oil, goes into automobiles. And so as electric cars begin to erode that, you're replacing a massive amount of energy with electricity. And it has to come from somewhere. In our lifetimes, hell, in my parents' lifetime, the electrical demand has gone up and then plateaued because our ability to improve efficiencies has outpaced the demand for electricity. So, you've probably seen this. If you've bought a new appliance, you have these Energy Star ratings, and it tells you how much electricity your appliance consumes. So a 10-year-old refrigerator consumes a lot more power than a modern one, and a 20-year-old refrigerator consumes. So same thing with air conditioners, same thing with dryers, which are the big in-home power sucks, right? So as we've been able to make these things more efficient, it kind of flattened out the demand for electricity. We're about to blow that to hell. And we're sitting on the edge of a massive increase in power consumption because we're replacing gasoline and coal with electricity. So that power has to come from somewhere, and it has to be able to go places, which means we're going to need better infrastructure. And I think that there's a serendipitous bit of tech right now. So you have over the last 20 years, you think about the advancements in computing power. Really, that's what opened up oil and gas. It wasn't a leap in engineering, it was a leap in computing power that enabled us to drill accurately to these great depths. I think you're going to see computing power and AI probably help us with our efficiencies in electricity and distribution and demand, but I still think that you're going to have a massive increase in demand for all things that go into building electrical infrastructure. The math just doesn't hold up otherwise.
Well, Matt, one more thought on the investing side of the equation here. When you look at something like solar, it's had a really bad last 2 years. The whole sector is down really near lows. And some people extrapolate that out to there's not going to be solar anymore. These solar companies are going out of business, which we know is not the case. But the contrarian in me looks at that and thinks, well, look at how undervalued solar is, where if you look at something like oil stocks, the XLE is breaking out to new all-time highs, and uranium stocks just had a big run. You brought up lithium. They had a big run a couple of years ago. But, there was a big rage for a while about renewable energy companies that had wind farms and solar farms underneath them. And some of those look pretty undervalued now. Do you see there being, for investors out there, maybe a sweet spot for some of the renewables versus some of the more established plays?
I do. Solar had its moment in the sun, and that was deliberate. That was a terrible pun, but there were better places to put your money because a lot of these solar companies, there is still that business aspect of investing, right? We still need to buy businesses. And a lot of these solar companies, they were terrible businesses. And so you have the theme, which is we need more electricity. Renewable is going to supply some of that electricity. Let's go buy solar companies. This is what we can buy. Where, sometimes it's the private solar companies that are going to be the winners. And these guys that are listed publicly are just terrible. And so you have this dichotomy where you think, oh, I want to be invested in solar, or there's a solar division of a giant company that's doing well, but it's a rounding error on the company's total revenue statement, and so it's hard to justify investing in one of these behemoth companies for its little itty bitty sliver of the solar space, even though that's really the business that you want to own. So, I don't know. I'm coming at all these ultimately from a business perspective. Just because these are the handful of companies that are public in that space, and I like the space, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where I'm going to put my money. If there's no good options in solar stocks, I just as soon not buy them, or I'll buy a basket and just hold my nose and buy the whole space.
Matt, what do you have to say to those investors that say this growth is too slow? Governments are supporting all of this growth, and quite frankly, it's just not as exciting of a sector because of how much we still depend on older sources of energy. So I'm not investing at all in any of these new energy solutions.
Look, it's hard to argue against that, man. If you put $100 to work in alternative energies 3 years ago, and you put $100 in the S&P 500, your S&P 500 bet beat the pants off of the alternative energies companies. It is um, it is taking long to get going, but that's pretty typical of these trends, but it is going. It's going upward slowly. Here's the thing. All you have to do is look at the amount of money that has been invested and is being invested in research and in acquisitions. When you look at all the car makers that have invested in electric vehicle technologies. They've retooled massive automobile plants to make electric vehicles. This is coming. And so, we've seen this with every trend in my experience. There are always naysayers, and there are always people who get in a little too early, and there's a sweet spot between the two. And that sweet spot is where you make a lot of money, and the people who get in late are the ones that they're the ones that I want to be selling my stock to.
Well, Matt, we'll wrap it up there. But look, you're always going to have people bashing certain sectors, especially these newer sectors. And yes, a lot of government money and incentives have supported these sectors. But when you do have governments and even some investment houses so focused on these growth initiatives, there seems to be capital available for them. And quite frankly, they're at least still growing, just at slower rates than a lot of those kind of sky high projections also had for them. But I find it so interesting to watch what's going on in the world when it comes to energy solutions and the continued mix that we continue to see. Matt, thank you as always for your time. I love chatting about some of these new areas, especially when it comes to the energy sector. We'll follow up with you in a couple weeks. We'll also post a link to the Mangrove Investor website. Have a great rest of your week there, Matt.
Thanks, guys.